include the British Raj in India. He is currently researching a biography of Warren Hastings, the first Governor General. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome with a big round of applause on stage, Zarir Masani. And joining him we have an award-winning author of 16 books of fiction and non-fiction. He has won numerous literary awards, including a Commonwealth Writers' Prize. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage with a bigger round of applause, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Over to you, sir.
Yes, why don't we take the centrist position?
Now, Shashi, how can I compete with this huge fan audience, of course, but I'm going to try. This is meant to be a conversation, so I think we both have a go. I mean,
a little closer, I think.
Sorry?
Mic a little closer.
Closer? Okay. Now, I would like to, I know you want to talk, and I do too, about what the British did and didn't do for us. But I think the question we've been set is, did we really need the Brits? And I'd like to kick off that by saying I probably would agree with you, to your surprise, that I don't
That is my surprise.
Yes, I don't think we really did need the Brits. But I have to say a big however. I think India, pre-colonial India, was a basket case. The economy was in decline according to all the independent figures, and I can quote you Indian economists, from 1600 onwards, from the end of Akbar's reign onwards. Mughal agriculture was stagnant, surplus was taken by Jagirdars, there was nothing to reinvest. Indian exports were already declining. Education was non-existent. There were no universities. Schools were in a dreadful state. Read Aparna Basu, the education historian. And so I think on all these indicators, plus the Mughal state had collapsed because of a series of invasions from the Marathas, from Nadir Shah, from Ahmad Shah Abdali. So there was a huge political vacuum which was affecting the economy. So this was the pre-colonial situation in the 1750s. And I have to say that, my criticism of the Brits, apart from their racism, which I would join you in criticizing, is that they didn't do enough. They were not here to transform India. They were not here to modernize India. Whatever they did was incidental initially to their commercial project. And nevertheless, I think they did more good than harm. Now, over to you.
No, well, I mean, that's where Zarir and I disagree. Now, the portrait he paints of India in the mid-18th century is not quite the whole story. India was, despite some of these things being correct, that is that agriculture was relatively stagnant and the later Mughals were quite rapacious through their system of tax collection through the Jagirdars and so on. But India was a sophisticated economy with a significant merchant banking system. It is estimated that the Jagat Seths in the 1750s, who helped finance Clive, by the way, actually dealt with more money in the course of the year than the Royal Bank of England. And this is at the time that Zarir is talking about. As to exports going down, depends on which exports. Textiles continue to go up. There's a very substantial paper which I have, you can find in my endnotes, by a research scholar who specializes in precisely this, that gives you details of the value of textile exports.
Tirthankar Roy at the LSE?
Exactly.
He says Mughal trade exports were declining before the British arrived.
Well, we're going to have to look at the numbers and compare them. But there is no doubt that we're talking about a relatively prosperous and complex society with artisans, with weavers, with exporters, merchants, shipbuilders, sword makers, all of these, so that not everyone was dependent in any case on the relatively stagnant agriculture, and that the agriculture itself did not, for example, involve landless peasantry. People lived on the land that they tilled and had a sense of ownership of it, even though they may have had to pay rapacious taxes. And as far as the overall economy was concerned, it may not have been an entirely egalitarian system, but as of 1700, 27% of global GDP, and as late as 1800, 23% of global GDP, citing figures from the Oxford econometric historian Angus Madison. So on that, I think
also have Madison's figures.
There you are.
And they don't add up, I'm afraid. But they don't add up to yours.
The point I'm trying to make is that to suggest that the Brits came into some sort of basket case country is laughable. There is absolutely no evidence to sustain that.
Can I quote Irfan Habib to you? Would you take it? He says the Mughal Empire was its own gravedigger. No new order was or could be created by the forces ranged against it either. And this, is from a very reputed historian.
Of course,
the
very
Mughal
much so. But
period,
no new order could have been created is speculative counterfactual history, and I'd say that any one of us can come up with a counterfactual. The Marathas, for example, had made considerable progress. Yes, they got a walloping by Ahmad Shah Abdali at the Third Battle of Panipat, but then Abdali went away again.
And the Marathas didn't build a single institution, civil society. They levied chowth, which was a form of blackmail, protection money.
You're not going to get me on stage attacking the Marathas in Mumbai. His address is available somewhere else.
Why not? Why not? We are not still under the heel of the Shiv Sena here. No, but I think, you see, the whole problem with this argument is, let's not get into counterfactuals, let's look at factuals. And the factuals are on all the best economic statistics, and I refer you to Tirthankar Roy, I refer you to D.N. Gadgil, the first chairman of chairman of our planning commission, which suggests that Indian manufacturers did not suffer significantly under the British. There was a slight dip in the 1820s. They picked up with cheap yarn, etc. By the 1850s, we were competing with Lancashire. By 1947, we had the world's fourth largest textile industry, supplying 78% of India's textile needs. These are all there,
Yes, indeed. But the fact is that the high-quality textile industry the British destroyed was destroyed. There are statistics, for example, showing that Murshidabad and Dhaka became the first cities in the modern world to be actually depopulated. They lost population.
Centers
and
moved.
The weavers thrown out of work were then flung into farms which could not support them.
Why did the East India Company throw weavers out of work? The East India Company was here to export Indian textiles to Britain, right? They were not Lancashire mill owners. Why would they be putting weavers out of work? They wanted weavers.
Well, I should think that what they wanted to do was to sell whatever goods they were bringing into India.
They were not bringing any cloth into India.
And they did. Of course they did.
No, they were not. The cloth import started in the 1820s,
yes.
And it was not. They were manufactured by Lancashire mills, which had nothing to do with the East India Company. East India Company didn't manufacture goods.
The East India Company was a trading company, but there was a bias towards trading for the British. I mean, let's face it, for example, if you take something like the shipbuilding business, what happens is the Indians are making these wonderful ships, essentially using teak and mahogany, which lasted longer than fir and pine, which is what European ships were made of. The average European ship didn't last much longer than 6 or 7 years. The average Indian ship lasted a good 24, 25 years. So when the East India Company establishes its dominance over the ports, the Brits say, hey, great, let's make ships in India. Better for us. So the British companies come and they start making ships in India. And there's wonderful accounts, some of which I've quoted, of the high quality of Indian craftsmanship, not just the woodwork, but the brass and fixtures and fittings and so on. What's the consequence? It throws people out of work in London. Shipwrights, blowwrights, the dockyard workers, unemployed. The East India Company may not be in the shipping business, but when this happens, what happens? The British Parliament passes a law that makes it impossible for ships made in India to ply the lucrative route to England. Promptly, shipbuilding in India collapses because nobody is able to make ships in India anymore, and Indian ships are essentially confined to the very, very small coastal trade between small Indian ports. In other words, the dice were constantly stacked against India. When Zarir talks about things like...
I'm sorry, Shashi, I have to come in there, because you say the dice were constantly stacked. I would agree with you about the 1840s and 50s. However, from...
No, the law I'm talking about was 1840s.
No.
Soon after the Napoleonic Wars, 1870s.
Yes, okay. But by the time you got to the 20th century, there was tariff protection for Indian industries, which Indian textile...
Oh, come on, the destruction of the attempt by Chidambara Pillai to start a shipping line is well documented. The British had no desire to see an Indian company in the shipping business. They drove him out of business.
Well, I have...
And he ended up, poor fellow...
I don't have the statistics on shipping. However, I do have the statistics on textiles, which is one of the big examples you give in your book of deindustrialization.
Absolutely.
And I think there is no doubt that once the cotton mill started in Bombay with British capital and technical assistance, they grew rapidly. They were supplying 8% of
This is much later, sir.
Sorry?
This is much later.
Yes.
Because why? The Brits wanted cheaper Indian labor. You paid them less than you paid the guys in Lancashire. It's as simple as that. It's not a virtue.
I again refer you to Tirthankar Roy, who is the leading economic historian of this period. He's at the LSE. He's an Indian. He's a Bengali. Now, his view is that there is no question that through the early British period in India, there were winners and losers, but because cheap yarn actually helped weavers, it didn't help spinners. But in the long run, he argues that textile prices came down, there was more demand for textiles, per capita consumption of textiles went up. This is in the 1820s and 30s, and there was more demand for the products of weavers. So by the time you get to 1947, there were as many weavers in India as there were in 1757.
By 1947, the fact that Indians had in fact established textile companies, not just Bombay, Ahmedabad and so on, is absolutely documented. But as I say,
I'm talking of handlooms. The handloom sector in absolute terms was as big as independence as it was when the British took over.
You still can't deny the fact that it went through a terrible dip between roughly the 1760s, 1770s. The incident that Robert Bolts, the Dutch observer, recorded of the weaver's thumbs being cut off.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. I want to take you up on that.